When is enough enough? This question is raised oftentimes in the exhaustion of conversations between friends or from the voice of pundits, podcasters, politicians, and so forth in the public sphere, albeit less tongue-in-cheek. And this question, when is enough enough, appears to be at the heart of many men's experience. It was likely over a half decade ago, 5 years ago, when Joe Rogan said the already famous words that men live lives of quiet desperation. And he was quoting someone else and talking to someone else. But the phrase seems indicative of the day that we live in, that men go about their lives in a sense of quiet desperation. Now, this isn't solely about that. I think this is about the greater experience that it is, or that men feel in the West, especially many elements of gun culture itself. But it comes at a time when we are seeing the world change before our very eyes, but in a way that seems so plastic and barely real that it almost seems fake. The kayfabe, the fake world of politics and punditry and news goes on and on and on. And I believe, no, more importantly, I argue that this pressure sits at the heart of what is much of gun culture. How long are we expected to go along with the farce? How long do we have to play this losing game against those who say with one side of their mouth that they're not here to harm us, and then the next moment, the next 6 months later, with a turn of the election cycle, immediately go to the podium and say that they're going to do the exact same thing that they told us they were not going to do to begin with. Now, this can be applied to questions like red flag laws or gun control or confiscation, or just this overall willingness to condemn others for taking up some modicum of responsibility for their surroundings. Gun culture, American culture, this idea that people believe in a right to bear arms, not so simply phrased alone in something like the Second Amendment, but something that is believed deeper than simply a turn of phrase. Is something that people, to my estimation, believe and act out that belief because they believe they have a responsibility to their families and communities and so forth. And it oftentimes comes out in this fantasy, oftentimes in very real fantasies like movies and film and video games and so forth, about what would it be like if we finally turned the page on history to the next conflict? Would it bring resolution, or would it bring mockery, or would it bring suffering? Would it bring pain? And this pressure that we live in, on the one hand, is a fear and acknowledgement that if that metaphorical next step were taken, the world would become even worse and darker and more violent and more ugly. If we were to crack open the can of horrors that is war, especially civil war in the West, we would rue the day we ever thought it would provide a solution. And yet, on the other hand, what is now is untenable. This future of war is bleak and dark, and as we know that war does not leave anyone unscathed, we know that it is terrible. But at the same time, we stand here wondering, could it be any worse than what we are experiencing now? And so this is going to start, in this episode, I'm going to start talking about that, this kind of cross-pressure, in reference to a book that I've recommended before, How Not to Be Secular by James K.A. Smith, which is a condensation of a large book by Charles Taylor. And in it, in one of his chapters, he refers to the Malaise of imminence and a series of cross-pressures. So, before we get any further, this episode is sponsored. It has been sponsored by Obsidian Arms. And if you are new to the channel, then let me introduce you to a company that represents many of the great facets of gun culture. While they do have a series of tools that they can make for you, one of those that is most noteworthy is their toolkits for whether it's the AR-15 or a series of punches or gunsmiths. And what I would recommend and why I would recommend those is because not only are they excellently made with a quench, polish, quench process for a finish that is fantastic for the types of work you might be doing, but they also come with a lifetime warranty. And so if you ever end up breaking or bending one, you can send them back and they will send you a replacement. And in addition to that, if you have been a part of gun culture for some time and you are trying to bring a product that you have been designing to life, and it's either on a napkin or on a CAD file, and you can bring it to them, you might find out, not likely from me, that many or some of the parts that are already in your safe were made by them. And so you can take on that opportunity with Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Let them know that we sent you or that you found about them from us. And if you follow our newsletter or if you are on the locals page, you will get a discount for Obsidian Arms. Now, the first passage I'm going to read comes from Charles Taylor himself. The kind of multiplicity of faiths has little effect as long as it is neutralized by the sense that being like them is not really an option for me. As long as the alternative is strange and other, perhaps despised, but perhaps just too different, too weird, too incomprehensible, so that becoming that isn't really conceivable for me, so long will their difference not undermine my embedding in my own faith. This changes when, through increased contact, interchange, and even perhaps intermarriage, the other becomes more and more like me in everything else but faith, some activities, professions, opinions, tastes, etc. Then the issue posed by the difference becomes more insistent. Why my way and not hers? There is no other difference left to make the shift preposterous or unimaginable. It's from page 62 in How Not to Be Secular, written by James K.A. Smith, and that is a passage from page 304 of The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. And he goes on to talk about this idea of a cross pressure where we have transcendence coming from above and immanence coming from below. We have disenchantment from one side being cross-pressured by enchantment on the other. And while we may oftentimes get bogged down when discussing philosophical ideas by only talking about the history of philosophy, this secularism that Charles Taylor and K.A. Smith are talking about is the secularism of today. And that is the idea that belief is just an option amongst many. That the mechanism of belief is no longer its correlation to reality or its legitimacy in an enlightenment, rationalistic kind of way, but rather that somebody believes it authentically. That something can be true and not true at the same time, so long as you are convinced and authentically believe that is the case. Where you can say that all roads lead to Rome, and you see this represented in these kind of trite statements that would be like the problem of the blind men and the elephant. If you are familiar with this sort of mind problem, this mental problem, it goes something like this. 3 blind men encounter an elephant in the jungle or in the woods, and one touches his ear, and one touches his trunk, and another touches his leg. We've assumed the gender of the elephant at this point. It's a he. And the blind man who touches the trunk says, it's a snake. And the blind man who touches the ear says, it's a leaf with a giant banana leaf. And the other one who touches the leg says it's a tree, like an oak or a palm tree or whatever. And all of them are describing what they feel. And so the idea is supposed to present that all of them are equally legitimate because they're just working with what they have. But the problem is, from the thought experiment, we know they're all wrong. We know it's an elephant. Every single one of those blind men was wrong. We might not fault them as some sort of moral guilt for lying because they were wrong. But the thought experiment itself foils itself in the explanation. And yet that is such that worldview is an excellent metaphor for what this idea of the secular age can be like, where all of those men are equally legitimate in their beliefs because they're using their best faculties. And in the postmodern way, which I acknowledge is very oftentimes the whipping boy of the political right as well as the theologically conservative, maybe? It wouldn't be conservative. That wouldn't be right. But it's the while there's no shortage of people railing against postmodernism, myself included, perhaps let's reduce postmodernism to this idea alone, that if I can't understand it, it cannot be understood. That is the principal axiom of postmodernism, that if I can't understand it, it can't be understood. And the story of the blind men and the elephant tricks the listener by appealing to their hubris, going, well, I'm not one of the blind men. I'm smarter than them, but I'm going to sympathize for them because they're doing their best. But ultimately, if their salvation and sense of meaning, the only thing that could give them meaning was to acknowledge that the animal was an elephant, then in accordance to the story, they're all doomed. And so when all of these things can be equally true at the same time, whether it's all these different belief systems, religions, or otherwise, they're just only as equally legitimate so long as people legitimately believe them. While this does produce this idea that we can all get along despite our differences, it produces an effect in our society that's only that the result that I can simply describe is suicide. By robbing or forsaking the mechanism of meaning and belief in people, or for us as people, culturally accepting this worldview, knowledge, or admittedly or unadmittedly, knowingly or unknowingly, we sacrifice in ourselves or not even sacrifice, we give up the thing, we condemn, we reject the thing that would compel a sense of meaning upon us. And so the sense of urgency you see in the moment, that we need to do something, or when are we going to do something, or how long must we be civil, or how long must we go along with this, with the farce, this sort of cry of desperation that what is being done or what we are observing happening in our world is not only wrong, but there are people responsible for it. tied to and in cross pressure with the realization that the solution won't be short and it cannot be as quick, or it might require something of us, that cross pressure produces the malaise of imminence in this sense, this pressure of if I'm going to even be so bold as to steal from, not steal, but to borrow some of the language from Smith and Taylor, the malaise of urgency. We urgently feel that we ought to do something, but feel as if we cannot do that. The one thing we ought do is the one thing we cannot do. And that is a classic definition or description of a moral injury. What many of us are feeling in the world right now, especially those of us in the West, even more so men, is that we are undergoing a series of moral injuries where there is a weight of responsibility, cultural, familial, and community-based, that we desire and also might in some sense bear on our shoulders, but that is the one thing we are forbidden from doing. The one thing that we ought do is the one thing that we are forbidden from doing in our culture. We ought be committed to the well-being of it and seek after its security and safety and so forth. But if you do that, then you're bad, because that's a militia now, or insert the slang of the day. You feel the pressure, the very thing which inspires people to become proficient with a firearm or become proficient or part of a gun culture or a community is the very thing which they are condemned for doing. It is a kayfabe of sorts where we know that it's all a farce, but there's a dark addition to it where we're expected to go along as if it was otherwise. The examples of these moral injuries that we encounter time and time again, whether they are or just merely temporary issues, or things that ended up being somewhat temporary, like how certain parts of the country and the world handled COVID, or whether it was okay, you were prohibited from going to church, but you could protest in the streets to the tunes of hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. You could, you can't defend yourself, but yet the criminal activity is using, there is no great punishment for, or any activity that's at least observed by the population in regards to the ATF in preventing or addressing the trafficking of certain firearms to gangs, Fast and the Furious, and so forth. While this is happening, on the one hand, you are being attacked for owning an AR-15, and the the woman who is running for vice president is lecturing the country in a middle schooler cackling way, which again is indicative of her aesthetic and in some ways character, that you should not have what she determines is a weapon of war, but she can raise money for people to burn down your city. Because the only crime worse than heresy to the government the only crime, the worst public crime that you'll encounter is acknowledging the farce. Is to look out, point out and say, that's not right and you're responsible for it. Because you're elected to be responsible for it, because you volunteered for the position, whatever it is. And so the cross pressure that we encounter, the malaise of urgency in this phrase, is that of an urgency that we feel we ought do something, met by a pressure that that we cannot, that what it is that we are supposed to do is what we cannot do, or even sometimes what we should not. It's not that we should not do, that would be a contradiction of terms. That in the same way, on a theological argument, that when we accept as a premises that all roads can lead to Rome, or all beliefs can be valid or equally valid so long as they are authentically held, then it reduces all beliefs to fashion statements, and the expression of your fashion statement is to virtue signal whatever it is that is your flavor of perceived morality. So when we reduce belief and faith by choice to mere authenticity, not some commitment to truth, not some courage in the face of adversity, but just, I authentically believe this, then we find that our belief means nothing, and especially to ourselves. And while it may not be the most resolving passage that we find in the New Testament, it speaks to this problem. And that is the 6th chapter of Romans. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? Or don't you know that all of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? We were therefore buried with him through baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, we too may live a new life. For if we have been united with him in death like this, we will certainly also be united with him in a resurrection like his. For we know that our old self was crucified with him, so that our body, ruled by sin, might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. And it goes on to say in verses 11, what then, shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one you obey, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you have come to obey from your heart the pattern of teaching that has now claimed your allegiance. You have been set free from sin and become slaves to righteousness. And Paul goes on to say, I'm using an example from everyday life because your human limitations, just as you used to offer yourselves as slaves to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer yourselves as slaves to righteousness leading to holiness. And the calling there for those of the religious is that we cannot live as if something is true and not true at the same time. And we can take that cross pressure, especially within the context of gun culture, and we can invert it in a way of seeing what might be left and right limits. And they are the fool and the coward. The fool and that level of ignorance requires a level of maintenance. Innocence, naivety, might be where we begin, but at some point in time, that naivety has to be maintained, and when it has to be maintained, we call it ignorance. That you have to willingly continue down a path of closing your eyes, dulling your mind, and removing yourself from the sense of responsibility. And that would be the path of not the fool who seeks after the truth, but the fool who says in his heart there is no God. And the opposite of that is the coward. Well, I mean, there might be a similarity. There might be cowards that are fools and fools that are cowards. But in this sense, it is that very oftentimes we desire to solve, we even might imagine there are these ideas, these fantasies of some great single event that changes the world and brings resolution to, well, the kayfabe, the fake life that we're expected to call true. And while there are problems out there, many of those problems, in this case, the kayfabe element, begins within ourselves. That it is cowardice to look at what is right and not be done and refuse to do it out of fear. While we might find ourselves frustrated with the world out there, with the mockery of different beliefs or the inconsistencies in politicians and pundits, and this sort of complaining cowardice that if only we got together or we did something, then something else would change. If only we stood up for our rights or stood up against our tyrants, or if only we cast off our chains, and if only we did something, if only the chapter finally turned, the page finally moved on, then we would find peace and we would find ourselves in a world where we get to live out that conviction which we feel called to pursue. But therein lies the problem. That we're relying on a fantasy to assuage the sense of urgency or even rev it up instead of making the small commitments, the things that we have influence over, the things that we can do, the things that we can do but we don't want to do, that we ought do. And we neglect the responsibilities that we have for the responsibilities that we could have if the world were to change, if the event were to happen, if the singularity were to finally come true. On the one hand, we have the fool who, in response to the weight of responsibility, tries to dull his mind from being able to acknowledge it. And on the opposite, we have the coward who knows the responsibility he ought to take but flees from it. And so often you will hear the voices of men saying, "Who will save us? Who will come out? When will we rise up against our oppressors or do the thing that ought to be done?" And while it may not be emotionally satisfying, the answer begins with, "Here I am, send me." Don't be a fool. Don't be a coward. Go forth and conquer.